The alien princess shunned human bonds, until one soldier shifted her entire world. The station hung in the dark like a lantern that nobody had asked for. Virat Prime was old, older than most of the species that used it. Its walls were made of a pale gray metal that no human engineer had ever been able to fully identify, and its corridors were wide enough for 6 beings to walk side by side, which was necessary because the beings who used them came in very different shapes and sizes. Some had 4 legs, some had no legs at all, and floated on cushions of compressed air. Some stood twice the height of a grown man, and had to lower their heads just to pass through the doorways that humans found perfectly comfortable. Humanity had been given a corridor near the eastern wing. It was a shorter corridor than the others. Nobody said this out loud, but everyone knew it. Corporal Ethan Rowe stood at the end of that corridor with his datapad under his arm and his uniform pressed flat. He was not a tall man, not a short one either. He had brown hair cut close to his head, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something durable, and eyes that were the color of still water, gray with just a little green in them depending on the light. People who met him for the first time usually thought he was quiet. People who knew him understood that quiet and still were 2 very different things. Beside him, Private Danny Cho was doing what Danny always did in moments of tension, which was talking. "I'm just saying," Danny said, adjusting his collar for the 4th time, "that this place smells like something old and expensive, and I don't mean that as a compliment. My uncle's attic smells like this. Nobody's been in my uncle's attic in 30 years. "Stand straight," Ethan said. "I am straight. Straighter." Danny straightened up with a small sigh. "You know they're not even going to look at us, right? We could show up in pajamas, and they'd ignore us the same amount." Ethan didn't answer, because Danny wasn't wrong, and both of them knew it. The session hall was enormous. It had a ceiling that arched so high above the floor that the top of it disappeared into a soft haze of filtered light. The delegates of the Convergence Accord were already seated in a long curved arrangement that looked something like a horseshoe, with each species clustered at their own section of the table. The Sarvathi sat at the far end, which was considered the most distinguished position. They had held that seat for longer than any human civilization had existed. Ethan had read about the Sarvathi before the mission briefing, which was to say, he had read everything he could find, which was his habit. They were silver-skinned, lean, and moved with a kind of careful precision that made everything they did look like it had been rehearsed. They had 4 eyes, 2 in the standard position and 2 smaller ones set high on the sides of their heads, giving them a field of vision that made it nearly impossible to approach one without being seen. They lived for a very long time, centuries in most cases. They remembered things the way other species wrote books, and they treated memory and history with something close to worship. Their princess was called Vailindra. She was younger than most of the Sarvathi delegates, which still meant she was older than any human in the room by a significant margin. She wore robes of deep silver blue that moved like water when she walked, and she walked the way she did everything else, like the floor was lucky to have her on it. Her 4 eyes swept the room when she entered, cataloging it in a single pass, and when they moved over the human section of the table, they did not slow down. Captain Nora Quinn, who led the human delegation, noticed. She said nothing. She had been in enough rooms like this one to know that reaction was a luxury she couldn't afford. The session opened with formal addresses from each delegate. The Drakan swarm had consumed another colony 3 weeks prior, a Velhari settlement of some 80,000 people. The mood in the room was grave, and even the species that usually found reasons to bicker with each other were quiet. When it was the Sarvathi turn, Vailindra rose. She spoke in the common tongue fluently and without accent. Her voice was low and clear, and carried the kind of weight that came not from volume, but from absolute certainty in its own authority. She proposed a new military framework, a centralized command structure led by the Sorvathi, with all other species contributing resources and units under Sorvathi's strategic direction. It was well argued. It was also designed in a way that placed every other species firmly beneath a Sorvathi ceiling. When she finished, she sat. When the human section was called, Ethan stepped forward. He had prepared well. The Terran Defense Corps had compiled 3 years of engagement data against the Drekon swarm, patrol routes, breach points, behavioral patterns, casualty analysis. It was genuinely useful information, the kind that could change the shape of a battle plan. Ethan had organized it clearly and rehearsed the presentation twice the night before, while Danny slept in the bunk below him. He was 4 sentences in when Vailindra turned to the Sorvathi admiral beside her and began a quiet side conversation. It was not subtle. Several delegates noticed. A few of the younger ones looked uncomfortable. The older ones kept their faces still, the way people do when they have seen this kind of thing before and have decided it is not their problem. Ethan stopped speaking. He stood there for a moment, datapad in hand, and looked at the room. He looked at Vailindra, who had not looked back at him. He looked at Quinn, who gave him the faintest nod, the kind that meant, "I see it, hold steady." He lowered the datapad. "I'll submit the full report through the Accords data exchange," he said, calmly and without any edge in his voice. "It's available to all member delegations." Then he stepped back into line. Danny, who was standing just behind his right shoulder, said nothing. He had learned, over 2 years of serving beside Ethan Rowe, that there were moments where saying nothing was the correct choice, and that Ethan had a better sense of where those moments were than almost anyone he had ever met. The session continued. Humans were not addressed again. Afterward, in one of the side corridors, 2 Sorvathi advisors stood near a window that looked out over the curve of the station's outer hull. They were speaking in low voices, but Vailindra passed close enough to hear them. One was telling the other something about the human presentation. The word he used, translated loosely, meant something between quaint and harmless. Vailindra did not stop walking. She did not correct them. Further down the corridor, she passed the door to the human quarters. Through the small porthole window, she could see the corporal, the quiet one, sitting on a plain chair with his datapad resting on his knee. He was not reviewing the data. He was writing something by hand in a small book with a worn cover. She watched for exactly 3 seconds. Then she moved on. Orin, walking a half step behind her as always, said nothing. But he had seen her pause, and Orin had learned, over many decades of serving Vailindra, that she only paused when something had caught her attention in a way she had not expected, and that those moments, small and quiet as they were, tended to matter more than anyone realized at the time. He filed it away, the way he filed most things, and said nothing. The station turned slowly in the dark, carrying all its old weight and all its new tensions, and somewhere near the eastern wing, in a corridor that was slightly shorter than the others, a human soldier sat in a plain chair and kept writing. The alien princess shunned human bonds, until one soldier shifted her entire world. The message came in at 0300, and nobody was happy about it. A Drekon strike had hit the border colony of Edris IV without warning. The colony had a population of just over 12,000, mostly families, mostly civilians, a small defense post on the edge of the settlement that had been overwhelmed in the first hour. The Convergence Accords scrambled every unit it could reach, but the nearest rapid response team was Captain Nora Quinn's 87th Mixed Deployment Unit, docked at Verith Prime, and not yet formally assigned to any active theater. They were assigned now. The problem, one of several, was that Princess Vailindra's Sorvathi escort ship had been in the same sector as Edris IV when the strike happened, and had taken heavy damage trying to pull back. It would be 2 days before another Servathi vessel could reach Varith Prime. The Accord's logistics officer, a nervous Velhari with too many fingers, delivered this information to Vailindra in person, and then stepped back a full meter, as if expecting an explosion. What he got instead was a long silence, and then a single word: "Fine." Which was how Princess Vailindra, of the Sorvathi, came to be standing in the loading bay of a human military transport at 0400, holding a travel case that probably cost more than the ship, wearing an expression that suggested she was enduring all of this on a deeply personal level. Ethan was already there, checking equipment. Danny was eating something out of a foil pouch and reading the label on it with great suspicion. Quinn introduced herself to Vailindra briskly and professionally. She told her the bunk arrangements, the meal schedule, the mission parameters. She spoke the way Quinn always spoke. Clear, fast, no wasted words. Vailindra listened with the particular stillness of someone who was deciding how much of what they were hearing was worth remembering. She looked at Ethan once, briefly. He was still checking equipment. He did not look up. She looked at Danny, who looked back at her with his foil pouch halfway to his mouth, nodded politely, and went back to reading the label. "I'll require a private cabin," Vailindra said. "There aren't any," Quinn said. "There are 6 bunks and 2 rooms. You can have a top bunk. The curtain gives you privacy." Another long silence. "Fine," Vailindra said again, in the exact same tone as before. The journey to Edris 4 took 11 hours. Vailindra spent most of them in the bunk, with the curtain drawn. She did not eat the food that was left outside her curtain. Once, during a patch of turbulence, the travel case slid off the shelf above her and hit the floor with a loud crack, and several members of the squad came running to check if everything was all right. She told them it was fine, and closed the curtain again. Ethan, whose bunk was on the opposite side of the room, slept the way soldiers learn to sleep, quickly, completely, and without any apparent concern for where he was or who was nearby. Danny had told him once that watching him fall asleep was actually annoying. Ethan had not disagreed. Edris 4 looked wrong from the air. It was supposed to be a green and brown world, mild climate, low mountains in the east. What they saw coming in was a column of dark smoke rising from the settlement's center, and a wide band of scorched earth where the Drekon advance had moved through. What was left of the colony was a broken cluster of buildings with people still inside them. Quinn had the ramp down before they finished landing. What happened next was something Vailindra had not prepared herself for, though she would not have admitted that to anyone. The soldiers went in, not in a careful, calculated way, not in a way that suggested they were running the numbers on survivability. They went in the way people go into a burning building when someone they love is inside, which was to say, fast and without stopping to think about whether it was a good idea. Ethan was first through the rubble on the north side. He had no engineering equipment, no cutting tools beyond what he carried on his belt. He used his hands on the smaller pieces and his whole body on the larger ones, moving rock and twisted metal with the kind of stubborn, methodical energy that looked less like heroism and more like someone who had simply decided the job needed doing and had started doing it. Danny found a collapsed section near the old community building. He could hear a child crying inside it. He called for backup, and when nobody could reach him fast enough, he went in alone, crawling through a gap that looked too small for him, and came out 7 minutes later, covered in gray dust, with a Sorvathi child, no older than 4 or 5, silver-skinned and shaking, held against his chest. The child was from a Sorvathi diplomat's family that had been visiting the colony. Danny's left forearm had a burn across it from the section of hot piping he had crawled over to reach the child. It was a bad burn. The skin had gone red and tight, and it would need treatment. He sat the child down on a flat piece of debris, checked her over quickly the way medics had taught him, decided she was okay, and then looked at the burn on his own arm with the expression of a man reviewing a disappointing but not entirely surprising utility bill. "Well," he said, to nobody in particular, "that's going to be a whole thing later." Then he stood up and went back to the rubble to find the next person. The child's mother found her daughter 20 minutes later. She made a sound that had no translation in any language Vailindra knew. Not a word, not a phrase, just a sound that came from somewhere beneath language entirely. She held her daughter with all 4 of her arms, and she wept. Danny was already 20 meters away and couldn't see any of it. Vailindra stood at the edge of the work zone and watched. She had not helped. This was not because she was cruel. It was because nothing in her training or her upbringing had prepared her for the specific, chaotic, loud, relentless way that the humans were moving through that disaster. She could not find an entry point. They didn't pause long enough to be directed. They didn't seem to be waiting for permission from anyone. She watched Ethan pull a man out from under a beam twice his own size, using a piece of pipe as a lever and a rock as a fulcrum. The man was human. The method was ancient. It worked. She watched Quinn coordinate 3 simultaneous operations without a command screen, using only hand signals and her voice. She watched Danny come back to the landing site to get his arm looked at, and leave again before the medic had finished wrapping it. She stood there for a long time. Orin came to stand beside her. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. But she was still watching, and she did not look away. The alien princess shunned human bonds until one soldier shifted her entire world. The relay station had no name, just a number on a map that nobody outside of a logistics database had ever looked at twice. It sat on the edge of a dead moon, half buried in gray rock, running on backup power and smelling of old wiring and recycled air. It was the least comfortable place Ethan had been in a long time, and he had once spent 4 days in a drainage culvert on a flooded moon, waiting for a storm to pass. But it was shelter, and right now, shelter was everything they had. The extraction route had gone 2 hours after they left Edris 4. A Drekon flanking unit had moved faster than the Accord's tracking models predicted, which was something the Drekon did regularly, and which the Accord's analysts continued to be surprised by, which Ethan found baffling but kept to himself. Quinn had rerouted them to the relay station and called in their position. Backup would come. It would just take 38 hours to get there. 38 hours was a long time to be stuck in a room with people you didn't choose. The squad settled in with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this kind of waiting before. They checked weapons, distributed rations, set a watch rotation. Quinn ran a systems check on the station's old communication array with a young tech named Louis, who was 22 and very good at fixing things that weren't supposed to work anymore. Violindra's remaining guard, a Sorvathi soldier named Kavan, broad-shouldered and formal in the way that suggested he had been trained to be formal since before he could walk, positioned himself near the door and watched the room with the look of someone who had decided he disapproved of everything in it, but was too professional to say so. For the first several hours, things were tense but quiet. Then, Kavan made a mistake. Quinn had changed the watch schedule, pulling 2 of her people back to rest earlier than planned because the Drekon sweep she was tracking on the station's sensor array was moving faster than expected. It was a sound tactical decision. Kavan, apparently, did not see it that way. He told Quinn, in front of the squad, and in a tone that was just barely on the correct side of insubordinate, that she was reacting to sensor data that a Sorvathi unit would have dismissed as noise, and that her inexperience with frontier engagements was showing. The room went quiet. Quinn looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went back to the sensor array without saying a word, because Quinn knew when a reaction would cost more than a silence. But Kavan was still talking. He said something else, something about how the Accord had made an error in trusting human command judgment in a live situation. Ethan had been sitting against the far wall, cleaning his sidearm. He put the sidearm down, stood up, and walked across the room. He didn't walk fast. He didn't look angry. He just walked over and stopped directly in front of Kevin, close enough that the Sorvathi soldier would have had to physically move him to continue addressing Quinn. He stood there and said nothing. Kevin looked at him. The room looked at Kevin. Kevin said nothing further. Ethan stood there for another 5 seconds, then walked back to his spot and picked up his sidearm again. Danny, who had been watching all of this with wide eyes and a ration bar halfway to his mouth, slowly and silently finished eating the ration bar. Later, when the station had quieted down and most of the squad was resting in shifts, Vailindra found Ethan near the back of the station's main corridor, running a diagnostic on a wall panel that hadn't been asked to run a diagnostic on anything in years. It responded to his attention with a series of confused beeps. She had not planned to speak to him. She had planned to walk past him to the far observation window and spend some time alone. But she stopped. "Why didn't you report it?" she said. It was not really a question. It was more like a thought she had not quite managed to keep inside. Ethan looked at her. Then he looked back at the panel. "Report what?" he said. "Kevin, the insubordination. You could have brought it through proper channels. That is the correct procedure." "Yes," Ethan said. "But you didn't." "No." She waited. He continued running the diagnostic. The panel beeped 3 more times and then produced a result that seemed to satisfy him. "Sometimes, the fastest way to stop something," he said, "is to just be in the way of it." She stood there for a moment. "That is not a doctrine," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's a habit." She crossed her arms, a gesture that meant something specific in Sorvathi body language, a kind of self-containment, a closing of the outer walls, and looked out the small window at the end of the corridor. The dead moon's surface was dark and flat and completely still. "You don't calculate it," she said after a while. "Any of you, at Edris 4, in that room just now, you respond without calculating the cost." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "We know the cost," he said. She looked at him. "We know it fine," he said. "We just decide some things are worth paying it. That's different from not knowing." She had no answer for that. It was a simple thing to say, and it landed in a complicated way, and she did not entirely understand why. The Drekon hit the station 3 hours later. It was a small unit, a probe team, not a full assault. They came through the east side with a cutting charge that blew the door off its frame and sent debris down the corridor in a fast cloud of metal and dust. Quinn had the squad moving before the echo died. Louis killed the external lights to pull the station off the probe team's sensors. Danny took a position at the junction and held it with the focused, slightly annoyed patience of a man who had been woken up from a very good sleep. Ethan moved to Valindra's position without being asked. She was already moving. She was trained. She was not helpless. But the ceiling section above her gave way without warning, and the speed of it was something that training did not fully prepare a person for. He pulled her back by the arm and took the falling section across his right shoulder, taking the hit and staying on his feet, with the look of a man absorbing something unpleasant but manageable. They stood in the new dust of the corridor, close enough that she could see the tear in his jacket, where the debris had caught him. "Are you hurt?" she said. "Not much," he said. It was 40 minutes before the probe team was driven off, and the station was quiet again. During the debrief, Danny noticed the blood on Ethan's shoulder and said loudly that Ethan was going to see the medic right now, and not in 20 minutes, right now. Ethan went without argument. Vailindra stood in the corridor for a while after everyone else had moved. She looked at the place where the ceiling had come down. She thought about what he had said. "We know the cost." And she thought about the way he had stepped into that path without any visible calculation at all. And she thought that perhaps those two things were not as different as they sounded. She was not sure what to do with that. She filed it somewhere without a label, and went to check on Orin, who had bruised his side in the commotion, and was pretending very convincingly that he hadn't. The alien princess shunned human bonds, until one soldier shifted her entire world. The long hours of waiting had a texture to them. Not quite silence, and not quite noise. Something in between, like the feeling inside a house just before a storm arrives. The squad had settled into the rhythms of people who have accepted that they are stuck, and have decided to use the time well. Louis was tinkering with the communication array. Danny had found a deck of cards in someone's kit bag, and was playing a game against himself with deep seriousness. Quinn reviewed tactical maps by herself in the far corner, her finger tracing routes that didn't exist yet. Ethan was sitting near the old storage bay at the back of the station, away from the main group. His jacket was draped over the crate beside him, the shoulder wrapped in clean white bandaging that Danny had made sure was done properly before he would allow any conversation. Ethan had a small light clipped to the crate next to him, and he was writing by hand in a book. Vailindra had seen the book before, through a porthole window on the station, on the first night. The worn cover, the deliberate movement of his hand across the page. She had kept walking then. She did not keep walking now. She stopped in the entrance of the storage bay. He looked up at her. She looked at the book. "What is that?" she said. "A journal," he said. She stepped into the bay, not all the way in, but enough that the light reached her. She looked at the book the way she might look at a piece of technology she had never encountered before, with curiosity that she was only partially willing to show. "You write in it by hand," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why not a datapad?" "My grandmother gave me the habit," he said. "She said that when you write something by hand, you have to slow down enough to mean it. You can't type fast through something that matters." Vailindra was quiet for a moment. Her people recorded memory in a biochemical way. It was precise, permanent, and orderly. Loss was archived. Grief was a process with defined stages. Memories did not blur or fade. They were simply stored, or they were not. The idea of a physical book, slow and impermanent and worn at the edges, was something outside of that system entirely. "What do you write in it?" she asked. He looked at the page for a moment. "Letters," he said, "to the people I've lost." The bay was quiet. "They cannot read them," she said. It was not a challenge. It was a genuine statement of a fact that seemed to her to make the whole thing confusing. "No," he said. "Then what is the purpose?" He turned the book over in his hands once. It was a small gesture, careful, like the book was something that required handling. "It's so I remember what it felt like to know them, so they stay real. If I stop writing it down, the details get softer. I start remembering a general version of a person instead of the specific one. And the specific one is who they actually were." She stayed where she was. Her arms were at her sides, which was unusual. She normally held herself with more containment than that. "How many people are in it?" she asked. He thought about it. 11 named, he said. "And some pages that are more like conversations than letters. Things I wish I'd said. Things I'd want them to know about what came after." She had known loss. Her species lived long enough that loss was simply a feature of existence, something catalogued and moved through and eventually absorbed. She had never had a name for what she was hearing now. It was not the same thing as grief exactly. Or it was grief, but a different variety of it. One that stayed open instead of closing. One that was tended rather than resolved. "Does it help?" she asked. "Yes," he said, simply. She moved a little further into the light, and sat down on a crate across from him, with the kind of careful deliberateness that suggested she was aware this was an unusual decision, and had made it anyway. "I don't understand your species," she said, not unkindly, more the way a person admits they have been looking at a map upside down. Ethan almost smiled. "Most of us don't understand each other either. We manage." She looked at the cover of the book. worn through at the lower corner, taped along the spine, a small water stain near the top that had dried a long time ago into a faint ring. "How old is it?" she said. 8 years. First deployment. She calculated that against his apparent age, and said nothing. He had been very young when he started filling it. She asked him about his unit, about Quinn, about how he came to be in the kind of work that he did. He answered without performing, no pride, no bitterness, no performance of modesty. Just direct answers to direct questions. She found this unusual. Most people, when speaking to her, made themselves larger in some way. They straightened up, chose bigger words, found ways to imply that they were more than they were appearing to be. Ethan spoke the same way he stood in a room, the same size whether he was being watched or not. She asked him if he resented the accord. It was a pointed question. She was aware of that. She asked it anyway. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "No, because we were new once, and new things have to earn their place. That's fair. I'd rather earn it than have someone hand it to us." She looked at him. "Even after the way the council session went," she said. "Especially after that," he said. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, quietly, "I cut you off." "Yes," he said. There was no accusation in it, just confirmation of a fact. "The data you had was useful," she said. "I reviewed it afterward. The Drekon behavioral patterns your core documented were not in the Sorvathi database." "I know," he said. She was quiet for a while. "I did not give you the courtesy of being heard," she said, "and I should have." It was, for a Sorvathi noble of her rank, an enormous thing to say. She said it the way he answered questions, without making it bigger than it was, without turning it into a performance. Just a plain admission from one person to another. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once. They sat there for a little while longer, not speaking, the quiet between them different than it had been before. Not the silence of two people ignoring each other, but the silence of two people who had said something real and were letting it settle. When she left the bay, Oren was waiting in the corridor. He had not been listening. He was too well trained for that. But he had been nearby, and he saw her face as she came out. It was not a changed face. Valindra did not change in visible ways. But there was something looser in it than usual, something that had been held tight and was now simply resting. He walked beside her back to the main room and said nothing, because nothing was exactly the right thing to say. In the storage bay behind them, Ethan turned to a fresh page in the book and wrote a new name at the top of it. The Sorvathi child from Edris IV, who had been found alive in the rubble and was now safe somewhere far from here. He wrote it down carefully, so it would stay real. The alien princess shunned human bonds until one soldier shifted her entire world. The evacuation ship arrived at 0610, coming in low over the dead moon's surface, with its landing lights cutting through the dark like two slow blinking eyes. The squad loaded out in under 12 minutes. Quinn's people were practiced at leaving places quickly and without sentiment. Equipment was packed. The station was secured as well as it could be secured, and the watch log was filed for whoever came next. Valindra was the last one on the ramp. Ethan was standing at the base of it, finishing a final equipment check before boarding. It was a small thing, a routine thing, the kind of thing he did without thinking. She stopped at the top of the ramp and looked down at him, and for a moment she said nothing, because she was deciding something. She had thought about it through the last few hours of the wait. She had thought about the storage bay and the worn journal and the 11 names. She had thought about Edris IV and the way the humans moved through rubble like the rubble had personally offended them. She had thought about the corridor and the ceiling and his shoulder. She had also thought about the council session and the way she had turned away while he was still speaking, and what that said about her, and whether that was the kind of thing she wanted it to say. Among the Sorvathi, there was a formal gesture, a phrase, spoken aloud in front of others, that was used to publicly acknowledge someone. Not a compliment, not a pleasantry, an acknowledgement of worth. It was not given casually. It cost something to give it, which was what made it mean what it meant. She had never given it to a human. Ethan looked up from the equipment check. She said his name, his full name, his rank, both of them together, in front of Caven, in front of Oren, in front of Danny and Louis and two of Quinn's other soldiers who were still loading gear at the back of the ship. She said it in the common tongue, so there would be no question about what it was. She said it clearly and without any hesitation. Caven went completely still. Danny's eyebrows went up somewhere near the top of his forehead. Oren clasped his hands in front of him and looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man who was very calmly feeling quite emotional about something. Ethan looked at her. He nodded once, the same way he had nodded in the council session when she cut him off. The same quiet, unhurried nod that meant received. Noted. No bigger than it needed to be. She went up the ramp, and the ship closed behind them. Danny waited until they were airborne, and then leaned over to Ethan and said in a very low voice, "She just did the thing." "I know," Ethan said. "The Sorvathi acknowledgement thing, the formal one, the one that means something. I know, Danny. To you, in front of everyone, I was there." "I'm just saying," Danny said, settling back in his seat, with the look of a man filing something away for a very long story he would tell later, "that you should probably write that one down." Ethan said nothing, but Danny, who knew him better than most people knew anyone, thought he saw something at the corner of his mouth that was as close to a smile as Ethan usually got. Back at Verath Prime, the Convergence Accords High Council had been called to a session that nobody had requested and several people had hoped would not happen. It had been 3 weeks since Edris IV, and the Accord was still sorting through the aftermath, the casualty numbers, the rebuilding plans, the updated threat assessments for the Drekon Swarm's new movement patterns. Vailindra had requested the floor. This was not unusual. What was unusual was what she said when she had it. She stood at the front of the session hall. The same curved table, the same filtered light coming down from the arched ceiling, and she presented a formal recommendation to the council. She recommended that the Terran Defense Corps be granted Tier 1 military designation within the Convergence Accord, the same classification the Sorvati had held for 600 years, the same level that placed a species at the top of the Alliance's command structure. The room did not react loudly. Rooms like this one tended not to, but the silence that followed had a specific quality to it, the quality of a room that had heard something it was not prepared for, and was deciding what shape to give its surprise. Several delegates looked at each other. A Velhari delegate began to say something about precedent and procedure. A Drothari elder requested clarification. Vailindra did not rush. She had not come here to argue. She had come to say something true, and she said it. She told the council that in 11 years of Accord membership, the Terran Defense Corps had the highest casualty rate of any species in the Alliance. She also told them that they had the highest re-enlistment rate. She told them about Edris IV, not as a story, but as a data point. She told them what she had seen in that relay station and what she had understood in the hours after. And then she said, "They are the only species in this accord that fights without the expectation of surviving. We have spent 11 years treating this as a curiosity. I am asking this council to consider that we have been wrong. An ally that cannot be discouraged is not a symbol. It is a resource we have been wasting." The vote was not unanimous. It was close. It passed. The human delegation was notified by formal dispatch. Quinn read the message, read it again, and then read it a third time. Then she told Louis to send an acknowledgement, and went back to her tactical maps, because there was still work to do, and the work did not wait for anyone to finish being surprised. Ethan was not at Verith Prime when the vote happened. He and Danny and most of the 87th were already deployed near the Outer Rim on a quiet patrol assignment that had a reasonable chance of becoming a loud one, which was the kind of assignment they were given because they were the kind of people who could handle it. Danny received the news via a short text dispatch on his datapad, read it, punched Ethan in the arm with his good hand, and showed him the screen. Ethan read it. He nodded once. "That's good," he said. "That's good," Danny repeated, in the voice of a man who felt that the phrase, "that's good," was doing an enormous amount of work and deserved some recognition for it. "That's good, Ethan. Tier 1. I heard you. We're Tier 1. Danny." "I'm just saying it out loud," Danny said, "because it should be said out loud at least once by someone who means it." Ethan looked out at the stars for a moment, through the viewport beside them. The Outer Rim was dark in the way that deep space was always dark. Not empty, but patient, full of things that hadn't happened yet. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, took out the worn journal, and opened it to the last used page. He picked up his pen. He did not write a letter this time. He wrote a line, just one, at the bottom of the page. It said, "Some things are worth paying for." He closed the book, put it back in his pocket, and went to check on the next patrol route. 3 days later, in a private chamber at Verith Prime, Vaylindra sat at her desk, reviewing a new briefing on Drekon movement patterns near the outer systems. The chamber was quiet. Oren had left an hour ago. The station hummed around her with its old, low, familiar sound. At the corner of her desk, sitting on the plain metal surface, as if it had always been there, was a single sheet of paper. Not a screen, not a file, not a datapad. Paper. Actual paper. Slightly worn at the edge, the kind that came from a journal. On it, in a human hand, were 7 words. "Some things are worth paying for." She sat very still for a moment. She did not know when he had left it. She did not know how it had gotten there. She thought about filing it, logging it, cataloging it, putting it somewhere organized and retrievable. She left it on the corner of the desk. She looked at it once more, the way you look at something that has no proper place in any category you own, and then she turned back to her work.